Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to another episode of a novel review, a book podcast. My name is Seamus. I'm the host. And for today's episode, I'm going to be talking about Mervyn Peake's Titus Groan, which is the first in a trilogy by Mervyn Peake called the Ghormengast trilogy. If this is your first time joining me, thank you so much for joining me. And if you're a returning customer, thank you so much for coming back. If you are a returning customer, you would know that every month I do like to do a fantasy book, and I try to do a series. So the last series I did was His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. The series I did before that was the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. So we've kind of switched gear by going for Mervyn Peake and Titus Groan because it's incredibly different for quite a few different reasons, which I'll get into. But before I launch into this, I just want to talk briefly about, I was with my writing group on the weekend and it was sort of a topic that I thought was quite relevant to fantasy in the fantasy genre. It's not exclusive to fantasy genre, of course, but I think when you think of the topic, which was world building, you think primarily of the fantasy genre. And there was a great discussion about sort of world building and what that means and what that looks like. And sort of the two main world building ideas or I guess processes are hard world building and soft world building. And it was just kind of interesting to think about it and discuss how there are some incredibly famous works of literature and film that have employed both these sorts of ways of building your world. The hard world building phase or I guess process is, of course, creating sort of everything to do with the world before you've even started writing. So the main sort of idea, and I'm sure you've all thought of it by now, is J.R.R. Tolkien. His world was incredibly well filled out before he even started writing the story itself. I think famously he'd already written the language and then kind of thought, yeah, I need a story to fit this language with, which is absolutely incredible. So that's a really great example of hard world building and sort of knowing everything about the world. So it's sort of understanding how, the political ramifications of, from the capital, how that plays out for a peasant farmer in a field a few, 100 miles away. It's sort of understanding everything to do with this world, the seasons, how the too much rain in this period affects the farmer over there as well. These kind of ideas about how the world really kind of unfolds. And then a great example of soft world building was actually Star Wars, the first Star Wars film. Someone mentioned during the discussion, when you think of the cantina scene, the famous cantina scene, George Lucas didn't really have anything in mind. He just wanted alien-looking figures in the cantina scene. And so that's an idea of soft world building where it's like, we just need something there. We just need to fill out this space with these aliens. And now retrospectively, they've gone back and started to provide all these aliens with backstories. You also kind of think of like, we just needed a hot planet, which is Tatooine. We just needed a desert planet for the setting. In the second film, we just needed an ice planet, which is Hoth. And there's sort of no thought that goes into it beyond that, which is good because it kind of produces that kind of mystical, magical fantasy element of the story itself without having this sort of hard built world. And I think there is kind of like a duality between them and a kind of way they balance off each other. I think you do need to softly build things, but also hard build a few things because you want your story to feel real, of course, and you want to be able to have a consistency that flows through the story. So I just thought I'd share that with you, hard world building and soft world building, because I thought it was really interesting, and it's, a very big topic, but also quite easy to sort of simplify in the way that I've just done it, hopefully, for you guys. So I hope you enjoyed that. Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that. Click the duck in the corner if you're on YouTube. I really appreciate it. 5-star reviews go a long way as well for helping other people find the show. But as always, it's a free show, so please just sit back and hopefully you get something out of it. Okay, here we go. Mervyn Peake's Titus Groan. I've got my notes here. I've got the book here. I've got a couple quotes to read. I think it's going to be a fun episode because it was I'm going to say it was a fun book to read. It's an incredibly different book and it's incredibly different book to what I was expecting it to be for a fantasy book. Straight off the bat, I will tell you there are no great sword fights in this. There are no great wars and battles and generals going at it. There's no fantastical elements in that sense. There's no rings of power and ice walkers coming for an existential threat. It's really just about this kind of great big castle, this castle of Ghormengast, which I think is a fantastic name, but basically it's alluded to that this castle is almost endless. Its halls are just endless halls and it's constantly crumbling. And it's this fantastical kind of blend of the real world and fantasy elements. the castle itself is just this great character that we enjoy and sort of pass through a lot. And, it's sort of, we're never seeing the true picture of it, because it's almost like there are whole lives and worlds that go on within the walls of this castle that you just don't see, and you sort of get alluded to throughout the story, but it's just too big and too vast a kingdom to possibly be able to see it all. It's this really wonderful story about the Earl of Gormenghast. Titus Groan is the titular eponymous character in this book, except I think hilariously, he actually doesn't really appear in the book. He's born at the start of the story, so of course he's 0 years old. And towards the end of the book, I think we celebrate his first birthday, so it's a little bit after that. So he's really kind of this, he's a side character really, because he doesn't really provide anything for the story, himself. He's always there for a few things, and a lot of the ritual that takes place during this, I guess, year of his life does center around him, but of course he can't speak yet. He's just a babbling baby that sort of sits in the corner for a lot of the story, and a lot of the story is actually concerned with other things going around him as a character. So I thought that was kind of interesting to not have him in the book really that much, but have him as the titular character. It is this wacky story. Like I said, the Earl of Ghormengast is obviously Titus's father, and he is kind of just fed up with his life. He's inundated with rituals and ceremonies on a daily basis that he has to perform as the Earl of Gormenghast. He really just wants to go to his library and read all day, and I think we can all probably understand that. His wife is not really interested in him. She's interested in her cats and doing her own thing in her own room, in her own section of the castle. There's Titus's sister, the Earl's daughter, who also just does her own thing all day. It's this incredibly, I guess, fantastic makeup of weird, wacky, wonderful characters that just kind of do their own thing. And like I said, there's no like huge drama in this book that goes on. Like there's no, I don't want to say there's no like political kind of climbing of ladders, because there is one character called Pike who does sort of, I guess, provide the central crux of the drama in the story, in that he is sort of like a lowly kitchen steward, and he does want to climb the political ladder and assume some power within the house. But it's kind of done in this very comical way, and it doesn't really feel, I guess, as serious as something like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, where it's, literally life or death. There is, of course, drama in this. I don't want to undersell it and say that there isn't drama, but I think it is really just this kind of examination of this wacky family in a big endless house, and how they're undone by ceremony and the pomp of their life. And it's kind of this really wonderful, charming fantasy fever dream of a story. So where this book really excels is the writing itself, because it is just this imaginative feast of language. And Mervyn Peake is an incredible writer, which is kind of annoying, because before he wrote this, he was actually an incredible painter and like a very widely known artist. And you can sort of see that come out in the text itself. Some of the ways he builds the scenes are like the scenes are built like these brushstrokes of words that he just kind of like gently applies, and the scenes build and sort of morph into the next scene. And it is a really kind of, I guess, artist book in that sense, in that it is embellished and very colorful for that reason. And it just kind of, I guess, it annoys you for that sense, because you're a really good artist, and you've just come in and wrote one of the better fantasy series. I mean, I haven't read the next two books yet, but I'm going to call it quite early and say it is an incredible fantasy series. I would imagine it's no one's favorite fantasy series, but I would be very confident in saying that it's in a lot of people's top 5, because it is just so incredibly different from the other fantasy books in the fantasy genre. So, I mean, I've got a quote here, and I just want to talk about it because even though it's fantasy, I think where this book really excels is that it feels incredibly human. And, obviously fantasy stories try to do that. They try to bring in a human element, but I think it's just this mix of incredible writing and these very simple stories. And I don't mean simple as in that they seem childish or anything like this, but it's an incredibly simple story in that it feels incredibly human. And so us as the readers can really put ourselves in those kind of scenarios. And so I've got this quote here now, and it's this kind of very hypnotic prose, but basically just as a bit of backstory to the scene itself. The Earl has had this kind of little gathering with his son and other people there, and the Earl of Ghormengast has brought in these pine cones, thinking that his son, who is not even a year old, is going to play with them. And then, of course, young Titus is, he's a babbling baby. He's under 1. So he doesn't really take that much interest in them and he doesn't play with them. And everyone has now left and the Earl is alone, reflecting on that moment of realizing that his son really wasn't that interested in what the Earl had thought he was going to be interested in. So this is the quote. "A sudden, uncontrollable gust of anger seized him. He had been childish in gathering them. Titus had not in any case derived any amusement from them. It is strange that even in men of much learning and wisdom there can be an element of the infantile. It may be that it was not the cones themselves that angered him, but that they acted in some way as a reminder of his failures. He flung the book from him and then immediately retrieved it, smothering its sides with his shaking hands. He was too proud and too melancholy to unbend and be the father of the boy in anything but fact. He would not cease to isolate himself. He had done more than he expected himself to do. At the breakfast which he had envisioned, he would toast the heir to Ghormengast. He would drink to the future, to Titus, his only son. That was all. He sat back again in the chair, but he could not read." And I mean, that's the end of the quote. This is a story about these ridiculous characters going about their general sort of ceremony and pomp, and then it just hits you with these lines of like, he was too proud and too melancholy to unbend and be the father of the boy in anything but fact. I mean, that's a brutal line, and that happens so often where it's kind of like we know what we have to do to broach these topics to friends and family, but we just feel too proud within ourselves to actually perform that act and be that person we need to be. And so we just sort of become these shadows of the people, these echoes of the people we want to be. And it just kind of like floored me, that scene. I was just like, wow, that is just so true to life in general, in the way that so many people struggle to unbend themselves and forsake their pride to be the people they should be to their family members, to their friends. So, you know, you can see from that quote, it's just this incredibly brutal story, and it's incredibly human in the way it conducts itself. I just found this other quote that I wanted to read to you because I think it just really captures the way that Peake was clearly a painter before he wrote this book, and the way he sort of uses art and has utilized his painter's sort of eye to capture certain lines of beauty that just really capture you in the story. And this is the quote. "Autumn returned to Ghormengast like a dark spirit re-entering its stronghold. Its breath could be felt in forgotten corridors. Ghormengast had itself become autumn. Even the denizens of this fastness were its shadows. The crumbling castle looming among the mists exhaled the season, and every cold stone breathed it out. The tortured trees by the dark lake burned and dripped, and their leaves, snatched by the wind, were whirled in wild circles through the towers. The clouds mouldered as they lay coiled or shifted themselves uneasily upon the stone sky field, sending up wreaths that drifted through the turrets and swamped up the hidden walls." And I mean, that is just the writing is just insane. It's incredible that he's just this, as I said before, an imaginative feast, and he's like really constructed this story, and this castle itself is this huge background character. So one of the last things I want to talk about this book, and I've got it here in my notes, is kind of how the story itself is this kind of really, the book and the storyline and the characters in this book are held together by the ceremony, the pomp, the tradition, the ritual that sort of dominates their daily lives, and how ridiculous it seems. And in the introduction, Anthony Burgess, who of course wrote A Clockwork Orange, which is an incredible story as well, actually talks about how the book goes too far in its overt over-the-topness. The grotesque, ridiculous names, the acceptance of conventions we can't take seriously, and this kind of self-mockery that the story employs. And he says it sort of goes too far. And I think that's really interesting to consider, this story going too far in its own self-mockery. But then I think you've got to consider this story in sort of the context in which it was written. I mean, fantasy is not the hugest, most overt way to tell a story in this times. It was released in 1946, this book. And I think there is kind of this, I guess, this reality pervading the text, because Ghormengast is this crumbling world that just seems to be endless, but it's constantly crumbling, but it's still being upheld. And even though the castle itself is crumbling, it's being upheld by the insides of the goings on, the daily life, these ritual, these ceremonies. And the over-the-topness comes from these ceremonies, you know, the fact that the Earl of Gormenghast can't put on certain clothes until it's been a certain time, and he can't do this until he's done that. And it's kind of this overpowering sense of ritualistic life that pervades this crumbling vestige. And I think that's really kind of telling. I mean, it's 1946. We've just finished World War II. The world is being upheld by this crumbling. Well, the world is crumbling. I mean, the world has literally crumbled around us, but what's keeping us going? Perhaps the ritual. I don't know. I wasn't around at that time, but perhaps the ritual, the ceremony, and those kind of ideas of the old world still continuing, even though the external shell of the world is just this crumbling mess and continues to crumble, but it's just being upheld by this ceremony and the world's sort of going on. Like, there's no mention in this book about any kind of building reform to build the castle or to reinforce the castle or to repair the castle. It's just kind of like we're so dominated by the rituals that are upheld through this story that I think make it really interesting and kind of provide this self-mockery. And even though it's this kind of ridiculous story, it still kind of pulls us in with the language, with the writing, with the ideas that are just subtly put in, and it just chills you. There are certain scenes in this story that just chill you, even though it's incredibly simple, and it's just this ridiculously wonderful story, this wonderful host of characters going about their daily lives, and there's something so wonderful to watch them and witness them through these sort of daily ritualistic things that they do, but then there's also moments that just chill you, and it's kind of, I think that's where you kind of associate or assimilate with the text, and I think that's just where you kind of see yourself in these moments, in these characters, in these scenes, in these rituals that we just perform day by day, and that's when it kind of chills you. So, I mean, I have no idea where the story's going because it's just this ridiculous story and there is no real storyline going, so I have no idea what book 2 is going to be about, but I'm actually really excited to get into it because, like, from the quotes I read today, hopefully you got a sense of just how beautiful the writing is and how easily you can be drawn into the musicality of the language and the artist nature of the language, how the scenes are built that way. So Mervyn Peake, Titus Groan, I absolutely loved it. Ooh, what would I rate this? I think it's going to at least be in the 4s because I think it is just an arc de triomphe of literature. I'm going to say a 4.5, I think, and I think I'm pretty happy with that. So Mervyn Peake's Titus Groan, I think it was absolutely fantastic. Okay, so what was I reading this week? This week I have taken flight on the World Book Tour for part 2 of Italy, the second leg of Italy, Donatella di Pietrantonio, A Girl Returned. I'm probably going to finish this today because it's absolutely beautiful. Really simple story about this family that's kind of struggling just in their daily life and this girl that gets returned to them. She's been away for a long time. I won't spoil too much because I'm going to do an episode on it next week, but it is incredibly beautiful, incredibly simple, and I'm really liking it. I think the translation is absolutely phenomenal. So stick around and hang around for that because that is a great book and I'm excited to do an episode on that next week. If you have made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for joining me today on a novel review, the book podcast. If you would like to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. You can also head along to the website and support the pod in other ways. But as always, I just want to say thank you so much for joining, guys. I hope you had a great time and I will see you next week.